how do we present multiple perspectives of highly contentious issues
Okay.
around justice and race without suggesting something like racism is justified or okay?
Well, you don't ask that question. You don't put it in those terms. What you do is you would present a situation in which something like racism or sexism is involved, in a context in which students can work to try to come up with what they think is the best resolution for the situation you're talking about. So you're not going to ever ask students to decide whether or not slavery was okay or not, but maybe talk about something like, well, what do we do now in the context that we're in now? In the state of California right now, we're having a serious conversation about reparation. If we do have reparation, for who? Does this include people who are not the descendants of slaves, but who've been impacted by racism? What about people who came from other places in the world where they were not at advantage? Are they to be expected to help pay for reparations? So you can bring in other contexts where you're not asking, well, was this okay or not? But you're asking people to try, students to think through solutions that are relevant to what's going on and that connect back to the history, but aren't like apologizing for it or trying to make somebody feel good or bad about something.
I think too, if I could jump in, I think there's a connection to the very way we teach history or teach about racism in the past. I mean, if we think about how we teach about enslavers, and generally speaking, we actually, in thinking about how do we, to go back to the very first question about empathy, right? Like, how do you teach empathy? I think one of the things you do is you stop teaching children to empathize with enslavers, right?
Exactly.
And we do that from the beginning, right? Like, hey, let's talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all these people and how wonderful they were, but we're not going to talk about them as enslavers and holding people in bondage. And then the kids get to that part in American history in middle school or what have you, where you're looking at early American history. Now you want to talk about slavery, but you've introduced enslavers and they're empathizing with them. They're seeing themselves in enslavers. And then, so that throws everything off. And it's the same thing with racism, because if now you're saying, hey, that what they did was kind of okay or justifying historical action in the past, then the students bring that with them in the present, right? They'll update it in their minds and try to rationalize it away. And so I think we have to be careful to be very historically specific, to point out sort of universals, like when was it ever good to own people, right?
Right.
As Tiff had pointed out in the chat, we have to be mindful of that, so that when we talk about present day conversations, there's no confusion, right? Like, well, it was good then, it was okay then, we can rationalize it then, so therefore it must be okay now in some way, shape, or form. So I think how we talk about it in the present is absolutely informed by how we talk about it in the past.